make up the SDCOE team for Project Arise. We are going to chat a little bit today about biliteracy. This is part 2 of our workshop. We did part 1 a little bit ago, but have no fear. If you missed part 1, we will get the recording out to you. All you need to do is make sure that you're registered for it. So without further ado, we're going to get started.
So if you're not driving and you can safely do it, please put your position, grade level, taught or supported, and language of instruction in the chat. Today's focus will be primarily on biliteracy with an emphasis on Spanish.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Something a little fun for you all to consider in this afternoon. What is the best cookie of all time? And we would like to get your professional opinion on this topic, as it is critical for us to know, so we can get to know you all a little bit better. If you feel a chocolate chip cookie is the best of all time, you can go ahead and add number 1 to the chat. If you're partial to chocolate with M&Ms, that's number 2. Oatmeal raisin is 3. Sugar cookie with some icing and sprinkles is 4. A plain, which is delicious, looks equally delicious, is 5. 6 is snickerdoodle, or if you'd like to share something else, please go ahead and do so. Totally. I get that store-bought versus homemade. That's exactly right. All right, thanks so much for playing.
So in our previous session, we began by talking about the guiding questions that we've developed at the San Diego County Office of Ed. And these are the guiding questions that we ask for implementing the science of reading for multilingual learners. The questions are equally applicable in an English only medium or in a biliteracy setting. So we ask ourselves, how are we supporting students to activate and build background knowledge? How might we integrate language development in English or the target language with differentiated scaffolds in context to ensure meaning making? The importance of considering how we're embedding oral language development opportunities strategically, leveraging home language as an asset and transferring those literacy skills through cross-language connections, and then incorporating safe and affirming, culturally and linguistically sustaining practices and content. And Melanie will put the guiding questions in the chat so you can have reference to those as we go through. You'll notice the color coding will continue as we go through the slide deck.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and stick them in real quick. Our first activity that we want to share with you all is a strategy that supports one of our guiding questions, which is, how do you support students to activate and build background knowledge? We really truly believe that if we are making strategic instructional shifts in the work that we are doing, then we're meeting the needs of all of our learners. And this is just one example of how to go about doing that. So in this activity, we are asking students to make some predictions and activating prior knowledge based on what the 2 questions on the right-hand side of the screen. And the first is, how can scientists learn about space without having to travel there? And in Spanish, it would be,
I want you to say it.
¿Cómo pueden los científicos aprender sobre el espacio sin tener que viajar allí? And so what students would then do is just predict, activate their experience with this topic, any books that they've read, any conversations that they've had, no answer is incorrect. And then what students would do after is they would read something about it, have an experience about it, collaboration through it. Maybe they would have some sort of activity that promotes oral language about the topic. And then they would think about, well, they would make a connection between what they brought to the table as far as their knowledge in the topic and what they learned and their reaction toward that. So in Spanish, they could write, of course, or if students in a biliteracy setting have maybe are a little intimidated to write in the language of instruction, then images are certainly appropriate there as well.
Melanie will put the template in the chat, and we're not suggesting that this activity be translated, but rather showing that it could be done in either language. And the template we're providing is actually in both languages. So if you're teaching in English, you can use it in English, and the same goes in Spanish. Another strategy that we wanted to elevate that can also be used to activate and build background knowledge is the See, Hear, Wonder. And in this activity, you play the video first without sound, and children respond to what they see or what they noticed. Again, we're providing it in both languages so they can answer in whatever the languages of instruction. You play the video again with sound, and then they write what they saw, and then you play it the third time with sound, and then they can elevate a wondering. So what we've observed with this activity and what many teachers have observed is the first time when the students are only using their eyes, they tend to write in their language that they're strongest in. So if a child is in a biliteracy setting, and their home language is in English, they'll write in that language because that's the strongest language. However, once you give them the language, because they actually got to hear it, they're hearing the narrator elevate what the content is about, they'll begin to write in that language. And then finally, when they have that opportunity to hear it one more time, where they've activated background knowledge, they've made connection between their two languages, and now they're getting to hear it a third time, they'll be able to have an actual wondering about it, something that they're noticing that they don't fully understand. Most of you indicated in the chat that you're teaching in English. This video is in Spanish. So we're going to go ahead and move on, but we wanted to share an additional strategy with you. Recommend there. Okay.
All right. So another way that teachers can just tweak instruction a little bit using the curriculum that they already have adopted in their classroom is this knowledge and curiosity chart. A knowledge and curiosity chart is a great way to do a couple of things. It's a great way to, of course, activate and build background knowledge. It's a great way for teachers to assess where students are and plan instruction accordingly. It's a great way to model writing for students, the alphabetic principle, and it's a great way to show growth in learning as well. So what the teacher does is they ask, depending on the target language, what do you know about space travel? And the teacher writes verbatim what students are saying, leaving space in between, knowing that they'll go back and revisit it. If there needs to be some edits or misconceptions, that's documented there as well. And then the second part is what are you curious about space travel? So that's the stretch and grow question that supports students in thinking about maybe opportunities where they don't know a specific topic, and teachers can plan their instruction accordingly, making sure that they are hitting what students are curious about to increase engagement and motivation. One thing I want to point out too is that bubble on the side where we really encourage that you use this activity as something that comes after an experience where students have some background knowledge. So maybe the see, hear, wonder would be engaged or taught to students before using this activity, so they have something to bring to the table and contribute to the conversation.
And again, we're not suggesting that you do it in both languages or that you translate. If you're teaching in Spanish, if it's a biliteracy setting, you would do it in Espanol. An opportunity for designated ELD would then be to bring the knowledge and curiosity chart and then bring in those connections to English, and then vice versa. If you're teaching in English and you have Spanish speaking English learners, you could bring in the knowledge and curiosity chart in Spanish and give them an opportunity to have those conversations in Spanish before you do it with the rest of the class. So these are instructional moves that you can make. We're definitely not suggesting that you do it in both languages. You're choosing depending on your language of instruction. And so we just wanted to share with you that on ReadWorks, they have an article. I think it's under the category of the space shuttle, and it really is about giving students an opportunity to experience the content in their home language in Espanol before you continue it in English, but it could be used either way. We linked that in there for you.
And then another strategy that we wanted to highlight is it's another strategy that does a couple of things. And one is to make an explicit connection to writing. So many times we have great conversations with students, we're reading to students, but then creating an opportunity for students to write opens so many opportunities to expand their learning within those reading foundational skills. So this double entry journal is a great way to do that. And I'll put it in the chat in just a minute, but it's really this idea of connecting the text explicitly and creating pathways to do that to yourself or the students' individual lives. And so in looking at this text, one question you might ask that is addressed in the text is, what is a challenge about traveling to space and how are scientists solving it? So this is, of course, done after they've read that information and have an opportunity to learn how that challenge is being overcome. And then it goes beyond just saying, okay, and then what does this mean to you? The teacher is actually providing explicitly a question to support students in that bridge between the text and themselves. So an example of that would be, what is a challenge that you have in your own life and how did you solve it? So it's really being strategic and selecting those questions to create that bridge between the text and the students' lives. So another great opportunity that this activity presents is that it is an opportunity for students to respond in writing, but it's also a great way for then students to turn and talk and share and present and increase their oral language opportunities too as well.
And you can provide sentence starters or frames. Another scaffold is actually to provide the text in Spanish, because you might have students who don't have enough proficiency in English to answer it. But just like Melanie did, just going ahead and reading it in Espanol, and you're not necessarily delivering instruction in it, but just giving them an opportunity to hear it in their home language if they don't have enough proficiency in English to respond. And in the double entry journal, because it's the student's journal, they can respond in English, in their home language, and even in pictures. So we're going to open the breakout rooms, and we have a couple of questions. In the previous session, we shared these strategies. Did you try any of them with your students? How did it go? If you have not tried them, which will you try and why? And then spend a few minutes preparing one of the strategies for your next lesson, thinking about your students, about their proficiency in English, about adding those scaffolds. Take a look at how you might approach this. So Melanie and I began with a ReadWorks article because we didn't want to choose a specific curriculum. And then from there, we found a video that supported the content. So just sort of giving you the opportunity to develop your lesson so that you can begin to apply these in your own classroom. And Mel, I'll open the breakout room if you don't mind putting the directions in the chat, please.
Sure. One thing I do want to say is you're not obligated to join a breakout room. If you want to try these activities in your own space, that's totally fine. Just go ahead and turn off your video and you are welcome to work on these on your own as well. And here are the directions. Is think about your context and how they might fit in with the work that you're doing. The message that we will really want to share is that these instructional tweaks that we are recommending, they don't take a lot of prep time, they don't take a lot of planning time, but they have a high impact for all of your students in the area of building language and support. So what we're going to do next is we're going to focus on the green area of the multilingual learner best practices. And that is, how do you leverage home language as an asset and transfer literacy skills through cross-language connections? So the next couple of slides, we're going to share some strategies on how to build these critical conditions or connections and build on what students already know.
Okay. So we wanted to go back to the vocabulary chart, which I believe we showed you in the previous session, but what we wanted to do was connect it to a text. And so if we were using this text, what would that look like? And so you would review and select key vocabulary, add 1 to 3 words that you know students would need to understand in order to gain access to the content. And then after you model on the chart, students would complete a student page to build a unit dictionary. We've provided the student pages in both English and in Spanish. And then when I do this in a classroom, I create the chart with the top being built as I go through, and then I don't ever remake it because I slice off the bottom and then I just add on a clean piece of butcher paper. So if I wanted to do the word, for example, explorados, I would ask students, have you heard the word before? If this is activating and building background knowledge, if they have, thumbs up. If they have not, thumbs down. Then they turn and talk. What do you think it means? I would record exactly what their responses are. Then I would find out if it has a cognate. So if I'm teaching in Spanish, I would just ask ChatGPT, does the word explorados have a cognate in English? And it'll tell me. If it's the other way around, it'll do the same thing. Pulling that final definition, Melanie and I have found that many of the ReadWorks texts have a vocabulary page with them. So you can pull the final definition from there, or if you're using your curriculum, you can pull it from there. And then using the word in a sentence for context and meaning making at the end. And so this would go in the student's notebook. And then one suggestion that we have as well is adding on an image that helps them remember the new word. And then while it is important to identify and select cognates, it's equally important to include a broad range of academic vocabulary and content. So we provided you with a copy of the digital vocabulary chart. It is bilingual. Here's another example of what it looks like. Mel can stick it in the chat for you. And then the students would build a unit dictionary that they would be able to hold on to.
Okay. So the next best practice for cross-language connections is looking at morphology. Morphology is so high leverage in making connections between the entire word or part of a word in terms of thinking about cognates. And so studying morphology benefits all learners because it really provides this great tool to decode unfamiliar words. It expands vocabulary by leveraging what's common and transferable, even within the roots. So in thinking about individual cognates, you can peel back the individual word to its roots, make connections between, if it's appropriate or whatever it is, Latin roots, and students can see that what they know in their home language or what they know and what they're learning is an explicit connection that they can make. So the next piece about studying morphology is morphology has been shown to improve reading comprehension because there is this deep connection between an understanding of academic and domain-specific vocabulary and the content. So if students are comfortable with looking at the individual morphemes of a word and discovering the definition of a word, and they do that naturally, then they are, of course, better understanding the words in the text, which then leverages an understanding of the text overall. So the next idea is enhancing spelling skills. So morphology is actually more regular than phonics in that the root, the base, the affix, the spellings stay the same, but the pronunciation changes. So if students are leaning into that morpheme, if they're struggling with spelling, then they can enhance their spelling skills. So students are looking at the smaller individual parts and then allowing them to infer the meanings based on the word parts. And then finally, identifying patterns in sounds and meaningful relationships. Morphology can do that to actually, if students are honing into the individual parts of the words, then they can use their decoding skills for reading. So there's a great article there that we'll share with you that gives you some tips and treasures about teaching morphology.
And so, just to dive in a little bit deeper, morphology is a study of how words are formed to convey meaning. The morpheme is the smallest unit of language that carries meaning. So, the prefix un, as in the word undetermined, by adding the prefix, it changes the meaning of the root word. So, what is the same? English and Spanish share many morphological features in common because of their origins in Latin and Greek, and those are typically cognates. And what's different is that languages have different morphological systems, so the tense, singular, and plural. If you're teaching in Spanish, there are comparable prefixes and suffixes often. And so it's a matter of really leveraging those for students so that they can begin to understand and unlock how language works. And we're providing this list so that you can see how they correlate to one another. And Melanie and I think just chat GPT'd what are the most common prefixes that exist between English and Spanish, or what cognates can you leverage in morphology for English and Spanish. So a lot of this is really just coming from using ChatGPT to bring this information forward, because if you can help students make these connections between their two languages, you're really setting them on a path of becoming biliterate.
Mm-hmm. And also too, focusing on the morphemes is this beautiful idea of if you're showing the connection between parts of the word, you're really unlocking several words in that instruction. So vocabulary instruction is, of course, important. And it is centered on one word, but morphology is this idea of focusing on parts of the word to unlock even more words beyond that specific word of study. So one thing we wanted to show is a terrific activity that you can do with your students, either in Spanish or in English, and it's a morphology tree. So one thing that you can do is select a root. The example here is port. And together, you and your students can build all the words with that particular port. And you can add it as many as you can in one session. And then, of course, students love identifying and finding more throughout their reading travels that they can then add to the tree itself. And one thing that we have linked here for you is this beautiful morphology tree that you can use in your instruction. So essentially the directions are that you're going to look at your next text that you're going to read. We recommend that you focus on highlighting cognates, that you select high leverage cognates with those most common roots that will unlock the meaning of several words. You're going to write the root at the base of the tree, and then together we're encouraging you to do this as a team with your students. Have them discover words, you write words, and so they can make those connections as well.
And so we're going to go into our next breakout. And the question is, what is your vocabulary routine? Do you already use a vocabulary chart? If so, are there elements from our example that you might add? And how might this strategy support students in expanding their vocabulary? And then the next part is, do you have a morphology routine? If so, please share with others what you do and what might you incorporate. And I'm just going to do a single breakout room this time so that more people can participate in the conversation.
And again, we see some people are driving, and that's okay if you don't join. Please be safe. Conversation about putting all of these guiding questions together. And so acknowledging that these five guiding questions don't live in isolation to one another, that there is this strategic weaving in of all five into all activities that we do. And we can't certainly parse out something like a building and activating prior knowledge activity, into that particular category. There might be opportunities for kids to respond, or there might be some home language connections that you can make within that activity. So we're encouraging you to look at these five guiding questions as a overlapping space between one another, and that every lesson can sort of weave in all of these in a way that supports all of the learners in your classroom. So what we're going to talk about next is reading aloud to children and the critical importance of it. Reading aloud to children is this great way to incorporate all those best practices into one setting so that they are, number one, modeled, but also students have a way to practice these strategies in context in a safe environment to lower their affective filter. So in doing so, reading aloud enriches students' language, exposing them to new vocabulary and grammatical structures, which is critical for learning a new language. It also contributes to their knowledge of both literary works in the world. It's a great way for students to collaboratively meaning make together in a way where something might make sense to one student and they can share that meaning with others, to enlighten others in their context. It also provides a window into monitoring comprehension. So the students can see that metacognition or the think aloud of the teacher in engaging in that work. It also contributes to reading. It demonstrates that it's this meaning making process. We're not just decoding words. That's not really what reading is. It's lifting meaning and connecting that meaning to various contexts. And it provides, of course, a model for fluent reading. And it's a great way to teach foundational skills in context, like phonological awareness and letter knowledge. And the great piece about all of this is it comes directly from our ELA ELD framework in chapter 2. So we encourage you to take a look at that because all of these pieces are expanded within our framework.
And we just wanted to take a moment and elevate this, what we consider to be this very interesting graphic that shows that listening comprehension outpaces reading comprehension until 8th grade. And reading aloud to students is such an important way to engage them with a text that is much more challenging than they would be able to read independently while they're developing as readers. And again, this applies both ways. If you're a biliteracy teacher teaching in Spanish and you have a classroom full of native English speakers, their ability to listen and comprehend a story is going to outpace their ability to decode with comprehension, and both ways. And again, this is from the ELA ELD framework.
So we want to highlight what the Commission on Reading says for interactive read alouds. It's the single most important activity for the building of knowledge required for eventual success in reading, and that's reading aloud to children. So some suggestions that we have in biliteracy and for teachers of English learners is selecting texts that have that are written in both Spanish and English, if those are the languages in your classroom, and also series choices could help to build and activate students' prior knowledge. And so being strategic about which read alouds is critical in engaging in this work. Reading the read aloud first. So teachers can tab some points to really dig in, to think aloud and have students talk and engage and predict and all of those wonderful things. So let's go ahead and dig into that read aloud. So an interactive read aloud does support phonological awareness in context, phonics in context, vocabulary development in context, and it models fluent reading and comprehension. We wanted to highlight that in context piece because, of course, students need practice in phonics and phonological awareness and vocabulary. They need to get a basic understanding of perhaps the phonics skill or the definition of the word. But they also need to see how that phonics skill acts in a text, because that's really the end point that students need to engage with. And so really being highlighting those pieces within the text will bridge what students are practicing to the purpose of reading.
And so because this is a biliteracy workshop, we wanted to leverage what you could do with a book in Spanish. So this is phonological awareness in context. And one opportunity is, for example, to practice that this code, which is the same in both languages, makes this sound. And so finding a word that has that information. So d says D says D, and then tell the children say D, and then they practice like what words form the sound D at the beginning of a sentence. So in Spanish, the D will be in different places. but at the beginning, it consistently it follows the rule. And so just really highlighting that for them and then calling out the cognate. Dia is day in English, and then asking students, does it make the same sound in English and in Spanish? And then having them say, yes, it does. And then really just highlighting that piece and then connecting it to the English because the text exists in both languages, and then doing the same activity. So if you're teaching in Spanish, this would be during designated ELD, asking the same thing, and then bringing it to, well, what words make that same sound at the end of the word? And just making those cross language connections whenever possible. And so having that awareness that students are constantly looking for opportunities to make those connections in their brains. So the other way to go is concepts of print in context. So doing a contrastive analysis, quotation marks in English, showing how they work in English, and then having that conversation about how in Spanish it doesn't look exactly the same way by showing both texts and then explaining how we use the long dash. And it can show that it's the beginning and the end of a comment, but it also can show that you have a change in speaker. And then by providing this visual cue about what's happening in the text, you can ensure that students are meaning making. All right. And then another opportunity here is showing punctuation. And so pointing out that exclamation marks in English appear at the end of an exclamatory sentence or clause, and then making that connection to Spanish. How in Spanish you show that it's coming by showing an inverted exclamation mark, and then it still closes at the end, but then making that connection that the end exclamation mark is true in both English and Spanish, and then the difference is the inverted one at the beginning. So just really, if you're going to teach concepts of print, bringing in print and having students begin to see it so that then they're able to apply the learning in their own writing.
And it is really that application piece that's so wonderful with these read alouds, is that you are presenting to students how language works. And so I want to pull out what Monica just said about that writing piece and how it's such a lovely final or ending activity to do with students because they've practiced it, they've seen it in context, they've maybe talked about it during the read aloud in a turn and talk, and now they've had all of these examples of the language that they can then maybe with sentence starters and frames add the writing component. So just keep that in mind with the read aloud. And one thing that we wanted to show you too, is we were having this conversation about cognates and morphology, and really how it's so lovely to highlight cognates in a text because it just does the same thing. It shows the cognates in context. Students can talk about meaning, they can make connections. And so on these two particular pages, nervous and nerviosa are cognate, and school and escuela are the cognates, and encouraging students to find even more, which is exactly what we want to do. We want to release that responsibility so students are searching for these as well and making meanings on their own, because we want them to use then the tool to create some independence.
And this also lends itself for some other elements of contrastive analysis. If you notice in Espanol, her name is Penelope with an accent on the E. So it just allows you to have that conversation about the difference between Penelope in English and how we pronounce it in Espanol with the accent. The other thing is in English, we abbreviate oftentimes when kids are little and call them a T-Rex. But in Espanol, that is not an abbreviation. And so in the Spanish text, it actually says Tiranosaurio Rex. And so then asking kids, how do you say this in English? And really just helping them make those connections, even though there are the differences in the text, just having them draw upon their prior knowledge and making those connections between the two languages. The other skill that you can easily bring in is fluency practice. And we use this example because we wanted to show again how you can use this protocol where you divide your class into pairs, and then students can choose what the emotional tone is. Are the characters happy? Are they hopeful? Are they tired? And then they go through and they can underline the important words that they're going to emphasize. And then they practice saying the words with the emphasis. And this is a really important opportunity if you're a Spanish biliteracy teacher to talk about the accentuation rules, because there you can see that there are many, many accents in this text. And so taking this opportunity to even teach accentuation rules in context. And then because they also drive the expression used when they're being read, and then you can give the sentence frames. My voice, went up because there was an accent at the end of the word, or because there was an exclamation mark. Just having them have those sentence starters or frames to help them communicate their ideas. And then I read it quickly, or I read it loudly, or in whatever way they chose to, because, and then explaining why there was the inflection in their voices. So all of these ideas are ways for you to bring the skills that students need to learn, but bring them into context. And whether you're teaching in English or in Spanish, the protocol remains the same. And it's an opportunity to help students make those applications so that when they're reading, they make that connection. And then when they're writing, they can further apply it. And one thing to note, if you're teaching in Spanish, Spanish is very transparent. So once you unlock the code for kids, that application to writing is a very natural, very quick thing. I believe that from everything I've read, we teach writing in Spanish faster than we tend to in English. It's almost like the direct extension of students beginning to learn their letter names and sounds.
So this last section that we're going to highlight is that bottom best practice. How do you incorporate safe and affirming culturally and linguistically sustaining practices and content? And really what we wanted to provide for you is this tangible resource. Many times we hear about safe and affirming culturally, linguistically, sustaining practices, and we think, oh yeah, we understand that. But what might it look like and sound like? And so we have a couple of resources here for you to use to promote this idea across your students in your classroom.
And particularly because you can't control what's in your curriculum. And so if you come to a place where you find an opportunity to incorporate these kinds of texts, we wanted you to have the resource. So Kathy Escamilla writes, educators must understand the range of languages, cultures, and experiences that students contribute to the learning environment, and strive to develop classroom lessons and routines that honor and include these whenever possible. And so just thinking about the sheer difference in students, and it doesn't have to be, an English speaker versus a Russian speaker versus a Vietnamese speaker. Oftentimes our experiences in life vary dramatically. And so as we give students opportunities to hear read alouds or to read books that really highlight these differences, sometimes they feel connected to the text and they feel like mirrors to their own lives, but sometimes they're windows into what other children might be experiencing. And then that creates an opportunity to learn and to build empathy and compassion towards others.
So this comes directly from our modules. And one thing that we wanted to highlight with this conversation in terms of multilingual learners is this idea of creating opportunities for multilingual learners to share ideas with peers in their home language as much as possible, creates this environment of welcoming students, and understanding that what they bring into the conversation in any language is an asset to the rest of the group in your classroom. Also providing text in both the home language as appropriate and English, and as multilingual learners acquire literacy, just really supports this idea where all languages are valued and really acknowledged as tools for learning and growing in other languages. And then also too, embedding opportunities for that cross-language transfer that we talked about, and being really intentional about identifying similarities and differences between students' home language and the language of instruction is critical. And you don't have to be literate in several languages to do that. There are lots of resources out there, even if it's just a Google Translate or Chat GPT. We have so many more resources at our fingertips that we didn't have even 10 years ago that could support teachers in creating these opportunities and making these strategic connections that are so critical for students in acquiring other languages.
And so we wanted to highlight one more bit of information before we give you some time to dive into one of our resources. And we wanted to answer the question of why it's important to incorporate culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. One of the guiding documents in our state, which is the California English Learner Roadmap, calls for us to incorporate culturally and linguistically responsive teaching. And the languages and cultures that English learners bring to their education are assets for their own learning and are important contributions to learning communities. So it's so important to consider the whole student and incorporate strategies that support their varying academic levels, languages, cultural backgrounds, and experiences. And truly, every single student in the classroom benefits when we value the culture and language that students bring to school, and we draw on those resources to expand students' abilities to engage in a wider range of contexts. And then we discuss the type of language that's appropriate for different situations. So these practices support our multilingual learners by validating and leveraging their cultural and linguistic knowledge and experiences. And this is directly from the California ELA ELD framework. And Melanie and I really wanted to highlight this as such an amazing resource, whether you're in an English only setting or a biliteracy setting. It really helps us to gain that understanding of the instructional tweaks that we need to make that are supportive of all students.
So what we'd like you to do is we want you to try on this tool. We think it's a great one. And it's the SDCOE Equity Library. And you can see that there are a lot of different ways for you to engage with the library. The first is you can sort by grade level. You can sort by different topics like phonics and phonological awareness. You can focus by curricular area. So there's a lot of different types of filtering that you can do with this resource. But once you get in and dive in, you will see several texts there available to you. And one thing that we are sharing with teachers is that if you discover a certain text with a genre that you like and that highlights the phonics skill that you're taught, that you are teaching this week, you can search for the book in YouTube, and 9 times out of 10, 9.5 times out of 10, it's there for you in a read aloud. So you can share then with your students and then highlight that phonics skill or that curricular area that you wanted to lift front and center for students, and you can share with them the text. So this is just a really great way to augment the curricula that you already use in a way that is intentionally supporting all the cultures and languages in your classroom. So what we'd like to do for the next few minutes or so is I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat for you, for you, and go ahead and click on the link itself. I'm actually going to put it in your browser or click on the link and just explore with it. If you are working in a particular unit with a life cycles or whatever your topic is, see if you can find some text to augment that learning and creating spaces for students, all students, to sort of engage in that work. It's a really interesting way to bring other texts into the conversation and support all students in the learning. So let's go ahead and explore for, I don't know, maybe 3 minutes or so, and see if you can dive into the tool.
Melanie, will you put the activity in the chat, please?
A really easy way to find books that maybe we wouldn't normally have access to. And so we hope you find that piece valuable. So what we'd like to do is we want to share with you opportunities to learn more about the work. And there is a statewide opportunity that I will go ahead and put in the chat for you. It is asynchronistic courses for you to learn more about foundational reading skills, about executive function and literacy, comprehension and knowledge building, and intensive intervention. And if you click on this link, you can access all of these courses. And there's also an opportunity to get units too as well. So we wanted to share that with you as well. And then one last thing we'd like you to do, if you could, it would mean a lot to us. We are providing opportunities for teachers up and down the state, and we want to make sure that we're offering what teachers are needing out there. So please complete this feedback form that's in the chat and let us know what you'd like more of. Or if something isn't there, what you'd like to learn more about, and we can support you in your literacy instruction. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please do fill out that feedback form before you go. We would certainly appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Have a great